Okay, so we're on Chaf Aleph Amid Aleph. We are, if you remember, if you remember what we did is 21a. I'm thinking 3.
I have 3.
I'm thinking 3. I don't have the. I left my. I'm using the electronic version, so I don't have the. I don't have the divisions here, but. So the last thing we discussed was the idea that although the Gemara started out by saying that it can't be that women have protection from learning Torah because they're not obligated to learn Torah. And the Gemara took a whole route of discussing, well, if they're not obligated to learn Torah, so then what's protecting them? It must be that mitzvos are protecting them. And then we went through a whole discussion of mitzvos protecting, how do mitzvos work, how does Torah work, protecting everything else. We asked the question about Doeg and Achitofel, right? That if Torah learning is so protective, how come they fell short? How come what happened to them? What happened to them? And the Gemara gave an answer. We explained another answer that Rav Yosef might have given. Okay, good. So the Gemara, in the process of this whole discussion, gave us a mashal. Do you remember the mashal? The mashal was a person's walking along in the dark, right? And he's afraid. And what's he afraid of? He's afraid that there's rocks in the road, there's thorns and obstacles on the path. It's dark. Doesn't see where he's going. He's afraid of wild animals, right? He's afraid of the bandits, right? The marauders on the street, right?
Snores also?
The what?
The snores.
The snores?
The
snores. No, he's not afraid. He's not afraid of that. No, but he's afraid, he's walking, he doesn't know where he's going. He's afraid of the obstacles on the road. He's afraid of the wild animals. He's afraid of the marauders. He doesn't know where he's going. Because doesn't know where he's going exactly. Is he on the right road? Is he going in the right direction? He doesn't know. It's pitch black. So the mashal, if you remember what happened, the mashal said, what does he have? Somebody gives him a torch. Right now, what was the torch symbolic of? Do you remember? Mitzvos. Right, the torch was symbolic of mitzvos. Right? What do we say? Ner mitzvah v'torah or. It could be the good name of a yeshiva, right? Ner mitzvah v'torah or. Right? So the ner is like the mitzvah is like a ner. It's like a torch, like a candle, but like a torch. So what happens when the guy gets the torch? So when he gets the torch, he's already he can see where he's going a little bit. Doesn't project very far in front of him, but he can see he's not afraid of the obstacles on the road anymore because he can see. It's like you go out with a flashlight at night. You could see you could basically see where you're going. And he's not worried that he's going to, bump into any obstacles or trip over anything, but he's still worried about wild animals and marauders because nighttime is the time when you can't, you really don't have protection from those things. You can't see so far. You don't know what's going on. So then what happens? Then dawn comes. And what is dawn comparable to? Torah. So dawn is comparable to Torah, right? Ner mitzvah, right? The ner, the torch, those are the mitzvahs. The Torah or. So the dawn, the natural light, that's the Torah. And that's much more serviceable to him. Because now, not only is he not afraid of obstacles on the road, right? He's not afraid of the wild animals. He's not afraid of the marauders because they all take breaks during the day. He's not afraid of all of those things. Right? The only thing that is still eluding him, do you remember what it was? He's not sure where he's going. He knows he's not going to trip. He knows he's not going to get eaten alive, right? He knows he's not going to get robbed, but he doesn't know where he's going. And then what happens? What happens is he reaches what's known as the Parshas Durachim. What is the Parshas Durachim? The fork in the road. And what is there at the fork in the road? There's a sign. And when he sees the sign at the fork of the road, so what does he know?
Which way he's going.
Now he knows which way he's going. Right now he knows which way he's going, assuming nobody has switched the signs. Right now he knows which way he's going. So it's an interesting mashal. The reason for giving the mashal was to highlight the difference between ner, mitzvah, and or Torah. That was the reason why the mashal was given. But we never went into the symbolism behind what is this Parshas Drachim? What is this fork in the road, so to speak? Right? What is the symbolism? What?
Roads that go from
What?
the neshama takes up to.
You say, Hal is saying it's talking about all the different roads that the neshama takes up to Shemayim. That's true, but that's not what the Gemara is discussing. But what the issue is, the Gemara never discussed, exactly what this was symbolic of. And that's what we're going to turn our attention to tonight. So what does the Gemara say? So the Gemara says, my Parshas Derachim. What is this Parshas Derachim? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines up from the bottom of the page. My Parshas Derachim, right? What is this Parshas Derachim? So we're going to get three opinions. Amar Rav Chisda. What does Rav Chisda say? Ze Talmid Chacham v'Yom Hamisa. In other words, remember, what's the point of the Parshas Derachim? When you reach it, you know where you're going. Right? Like sort of you reach it, you know where your destination is. So what does Rav Chisda say? That must be the Talmud Chacham and the day of death. What does he mean? What does Rav Chisda mean, the Talmud Chacham and the day of death? What does that mean? So the way the Mefarshim explain Rav Chisda, it means you're a Talmud Chacham when you die. Right? That if you make it to your day of death as a Talmud Chacham, so you know you've arrived. Right? So you know you've arrived. This is Rav Chisda's position. Let's look at the other positions, and then we'll come back and we'll examine Rav Chisda's position. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Zet Talmid Chacham v'yiras chet. What are we talking about? He has a different symbolism to the Parshas Derachim. What does he say? When you're a Talmid Chacham and you've acquired yiras chet, so then you know you've arrived. Okay. Now, that's what Rav Chisda says. You're a Talmid Chacham and you die. You die as a Talmid Chacham. And the second opinion, which is the opinion of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, says you're a Talmid Chacham and you've acquired yiras chet. What does this mean? Right? What is this idea of Parshas Derachim? So remember, the idea is what was this Parshas Derachim? You know where you're going, or you know when you've arrived, so to speak. And that's how this is being interpreted. According to the first opinion, according to this opinion of Rabbi Chisda, a Talmud Chacham in Yom HaMisa. What does that mean? Because until you die, you can never be sure that you are going to stay on the proper path until your day of death. When you die, if you're on the proper path, so what does that say? You made it, right? You can't go off it anymore, right? That when you die, if you die while you're on the proper path, so then that's it. You made it, right? You made it to the end. You've avoided any temptation. You are no longer going to stray from the path because you're no longer alive.
Right.
But you can't. But you have in effect reached your destination. In other words, you've made it. This is a very interesting Gemara. This discussion, this idea of Rav Chisda, that a Talmid Chacham makes it when he dies as a Talmid Chacham, because of the fact that at any point up until the moment of death, you might stray from the proper path. Right? So what is this based on? How mentions Acher? Acher, who was Acher? Elisha ben Abuya. But Elisha ben Abuya, who grew up as a Talmid Chacham and ultimately went off of the path. Right, went off of the path. You know the famous story about Acher. He saw a father told his son to climb up a tree and to get to chase away the mother bird before taking the young from the nest. And that's exactly what happened, right? The son went up to get the chase away the mother bird, and what happened? And sure enough, there's room down here. Right? And sure enough, what happened? And sure enough, the son fell and died. And at that point, Elisha ben Abuya said, "Oh, this is the Torah. This is the reward." And he became an acher. He became a stranger. He went off the derech, right, straight from the path. Okay. So yes, acher is an example of that. But there's a fascinating Gemara in Maseches Brachos. Starts in Maseches Brachos. It goes to Maseches Avodah Zarah. Let me share some of this Gemara with you. Okay, the Gemara says as follows. It's a little bit of a long Gemara. The Gemara discusses actually the Shmona Esrei.
What parak again?
It is Brachos Chavches Amud Beis. Brachos Chavches Amud Beis. Right? And the Gemara is discussing the. What? Oh.
We should zoom in just to get the.
Oh, there you go. Well, so I could project it on the screen. Yeah. All right. I'm gonna do it outside. I could have made copies, but I figured I would just do it outside. It's at the very bottom of the page. So in order to understand this Gemara, we need to understand a little bit about the history of the Shmona Esrei. Right? When did the Shmona Esrei become the Shmona Esrei?
After they added
Okay. I guess that's a leading question. When did the Shmona Esrei become the Shmona Esrei? Like, what the heck am I asking? Right? So let's understand that the official, I guess, codification, is that the word I'm looking for? The official codification of the Shmona Esrei, the official formulation of the Shmona Esrei took place, as I think Hal mentioned, maybe a couple of others of you mentioned, at the time of the Anshe Knesses Hagedolah. Right? Oh, that's you, Ron. Right? The Anshe Knesses. We're just gonna right? The Anshe Knesses Hagedolah, or Anshe Knesses Hagedolah. So, when was the period of the Anshe Knesses Hagedolah? Anybody know? Pre-Beis Hamikdash, first Beis Hamikdash, second Beis Hamikdash. When was it?
It was after, but
It was after, at least certainly after the first Beis Hamikdash.
It was after the first Beis Hamikdash,
The second.
at the beginning of the time of the second Beis Hamikdash. That was the Anshe Knesses Hagedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. It was at the tail end of the period of Nevuah. Right? Nevuah ends with whom? With Ezra, Nehemiah, right? They are the last of the Nevi'im, and they are the members of the Anshe Knesses Hagedolah. So just sort of imagine where Bnei Yisrael were at this point, right? We had been We had been exiled, right? The Jews were living in Babylonia, right? They were living in Bavel, right? They were living in Bavel. This was the first, right? They were living in Bavel, and only a small percentage of the Jews came back to build the Beis Hamikdash. The rest stayed home because of COVID, but a small group came back to build the Beis Hamikdash. And what did the Anshe Knesses Hagedolah do? They said, you know what? We need some kind of structure, some kind of formalized structure to ensure that this doesn't get forgotten among the people. What was there before? What happened during the Beis Hamikdash? There were karbanos. Were there tfilos?
there may have been individual.
Was there shul?
No.
Were there shuls?
No.
Sure, there were shuls.
Were there dues?
Were there dues? If there were shuls, there were dues. Right? If there were shuls, there were dues.
The dues came
Right?
first.
There were shuls. What happened in the shuls? What did they do in the shuls? What did people come together in the shuls for?
Learning. Casino
to
nights.
to read the parsha, right? Remember, Bnei Yisrael had, when they came into Eretz Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael had the Art Scroll Chumash, right? They had the whole Chumash, right? They had it all. Yes, the truth is, Nach sort of played out over the years, but the whole Chumash they had. In fact, they used to get together in Mitzrayim. They used to get together to chazer over whatever writings they had at that time. But certainly by the time Bnei Yisrael came into Eretz Yisrael, they had a Torah. So what did they do with the Torah? So Moshe Rabbeinu, if you remember, Moshe Rabbeinu legislated that the Torah had to be read once a week. And then Ezra came along and legislated that it needed to be read 2 additional times a week. But initially the Torah was read every Shabbos. So there were shuls where the Torah was read every Shabbos. But was there davening? There was individual davening, right? There were karbanos, and there were individual davening. In other words, people davened for things that they wanted, but there was no formal structure. The formal structure was finally put into place during the time of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah because of the deterioration of the Jewish community. Because they had, they were in Bavel, they were living in Bavel, they had been away from a Beis Hamikdash for 70 years, for a generation, right, away from a Beis Hamikdash, and all of this they were losing, this was dissipating. So the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah formulated what we refer to as the Shemona Esrei because there were originally 18 brachos in this. Where did the 18 brachos come from? Why, right? Why? Right? So the different opinions which the Gemara brings as to why the number 18, and then the Gemara in Maseches Megillah goes through a whole Megillah. That's why it's there. Right? The Gemara in Maseches Megillah goes through a whole Megillah of what was the source for the various brachos. Why avos? Right? Why gevuros? Why kiddushin? Why did they follow? Right? Why is this bracha number 7? Why is this bracha number 8? The Gemara goes through it all. Right? And what's amazing is, even though, if you've ever davened, most of us daven Ashkenaz, but you daven in a Sephardi shul, there's some slight changes in words, but the brachos are the same. The order is the same. The brachos are the same. It's an amazing thing, right? Despite what's happened to the Jewish people, that formulation stayed the same. So that was done in the time of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. And then what happened is, even though the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah established it, it again became forgotten from among the Jewish people. Now, this is not right. It's not unusual to think about these things. Like, what do you mean the Jewish people forgot? Read through the keynotes of Tisha B'Av morning and learn how the Jewish people forgot the Torah. Right? They stopped reading the Torah. They forgot about the Torah. So to think that they forgot about davening, right? How hard is that to forget about davening, right? Especially you don't do it, you forget about it. It's not like they had Sidurim that they could just open up. Remember, how did they daven in those days? There was a Shliach Tzibur. He davened and they all listened because they didn't memorize. You didn't have a sitter, right? They all listened to his davening. He memorized it and they were Yotzei with his davening. So if you weren't coming to shul, if you weren't involved with this, so what's going to happen? So our Gemara, the Gemara Maseches Brachos at the bottom of the page picks up. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught the following. Shimon HaPikuli, Shimon, who was a cotton dealer, right? He dealt with cotton and cloth. Hisdir Yurches Brachos Lifnei Rabban Gamliel. Al Haseder Biyavne. What did he do? He reestablished the 18 brachos the way they had been. In other words, he was the person who kept the tradition alive and was able to say over to Rabban Gamliel, this is how the 18 brachos of the Shemona Esrei were set up. He was the one who kept that tradition alive. Amar lehem Rabban Gamliel lechachamim. So at the time, Rabban Gamliel said to the chachamim, Klum yesh adam sheyodea l'sakein birchas had sadukim. Right? What are we talking about? So in the days of Rabban Gamliel, there was this huge conflict between rabbinic Judaism, which were known as the Perushim, and the Sadducees, the Tzadukim, who didn't believe in a Torah Sheba'al Peh. They didn't believe in a rabbinic Judaism. I wouldn't have a job if you were all Tzadukim, right? So there was rabbinic Judaism, the Perushim, and they were the Tzadukim. And one of the classical differences that we bring talks about the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim, right? That when you read through during Musaf time, you read the preparation. So the Kohen Gadol was prepared before Yom Kippurim, and he was the Kohanim who taught him, who reviewed with him all of the details. Had to tell him, make sure that you do it this way, and don't do it any other way. And then he cried because they thought maybe he was a tzedukah, and they cried because they had to even take the step of maybe explaining it, that maybe he thought that they thought that he was a tzedukah. So that was one of the classical instances. Another one of the classical instances actually goes back to something that we learned in this past week's parsha. Right, the beginning of Parshas Vayakel, right? Lo sivaru eish b'chol moshvo seichem b'yom haShabbos, right? How did the Tzedukim understand that?
You sit in the dark.
You sit in the dark on Shabbos, right? Unless it's natural light, you sit in the dark. You can't benefit at all from a fire. Lo sivaru eish b'chol moshvo seichem b'yom haShabbos, right? You can't benefit at all from a fire. You can't have warm food. You can't have light if it's not light outside. That was how the Tzedukim observed Shabbos. Right? Obviously, it's fascinating that I once gave a shiur on the halachic and hashkafic ramifications of food that we eat on Shabbos. Cholent, the halachic and hashkafic ramification of cholent is to enable us to eat hot food on Shabbos. That it became a mitzvah to eat hot food on Shabbos, to sort of say, hey, I belong to rabbinic Judaism, and I don't live as a tzedukah. Okay. So in the days of Rabban Gamliel, there was this divisiveness between the Prushim and the Tzedukim, and causing tremendous problems for the Jewish community. Rabban Gamliel asked the Chachamim, he said, is there anybody who can add a bracha, who can write the text of a bracha against the Tzedukim? So one person stood up. Do you know who he was? Anybody remember his name? Shmuel HaKatan. His name was Shmuel HaKatan, right? Shmuel the little guy, right? Shmuel the Katan, right? Right? Shmuel the lesser Shmuel, if you will, and he was the one who got up and he wrote this. Right, he wrote this bracha against the Tzedukim. Okay, very nice. So why was he able to write it? Because he was he didn't think of himself as he wasn't haughty, he wasn't arrogant. He was Shmuel HaKatan, right? So he was able to write this bracha. V'lam al shinim, that's the bracha, the 19th bracha, v'lam al shinim. Al-Tihi. So very interesting discussion. A lot of stuff to read about Shmuel HaKatan and the political climate at the time, and one can imagine you take such a political step of writing this bracha, and the bracha becomes associated with you, all kinds of political ramifications for Shmuel HaKatan. Anyway, the Gemara tells us it was a year later, right? The next year, it was Shmuel HaKatan who got up to lead the davening. And he got up to the bracha of V'lam al Shinim, and he started it, says the Gemara, the Shana Acheres. The next year, he started it, V'shachacha. And what happened? In the middle of the bracha, he forgot. Again, remember, there's no Sidurim, right? There's nothing printed, there's nothing written, right? So he forgot. So what was the halacha? It's interesting, the Shulchan Aruch talks about this. What's the halacha if the Shaliach Tzibor gets oiskadreit? If the Shaliach Tzibor gets confused, he gets mixed up, right? What's the halacha? So today the halacha is not particularly relevant. Why? Because you have a siddur. You get mixed up. Right? You get mixed up. What happens? Right? You have a page. Right? You go to the page and it's right there. It's interesting. I was once with Cantor Crone, and it's during the davening, and all of a sudden, something is wrong. Something is wrong. So I run up. I think it was like Rosh Hashanah. I was using a mach, so I run up. Page had gotten stuck together. The page had gotten stuck together. Sometimes it happens, right? So the page had gotten stuck together, and he flipped it, and he was, davening from the words, but he also knew something was not right. But these were the words, so we had to figure out what it was. So you get oiskadrate a little bit, so you can go back and you can, you can get your place, and that's it. In those days when there were no siddurim. Right, and the shliach tzibur davened Baal Pei, davened by memory. If he got mixed up, sometimes it was impossible to get back to where he is. Sometimes, I don't know if that ever happens to you. It happens to me. Sometimes I'm davening Shmon Esrei, and I'm not looking in the siddur. I should be looking in the siddur. I'm not looking in the siddur. I'm going to klap al chet. If my wife hears this, I'm in gahak tzoros, because you always have to look in the siddur. You always have to daven from the siddur, right? So I'm not davening from the siddur, and then what happens?
You get lost.
I'm like, where am I?
Right.
I'm like, where am I? Now, sometimes that happens when I'm driving also. And that's a different story.
Wait, you're looking in the siddur while you're driving?
No, sometimes I'm driving.
Wife's looking in the siddur
Sometimes
while
I'm
you're
driving and all of a sudden I'm like, wait a second, where am I?
Going, right?
And you hear people, you hear stories like that. People just, I drove 3 miles past my exit because I wasn't paying attention, whatever. Okay, so, you're davening by rote and you're not paying attention. All of a sudden, where am I? What am I up to? So what was the halacha if the shliach tzibur davened the wrong thing, or got stuck, or got confused? What was the halacha?
You go back to the
Start
beginning.
over to the
You
early,
take him,
back to the earlier bracha.
you get rid of him.
Really?
Yeah, you get rid of him, and you no. Obviously, we're talking about somebody who can't regroup.
Okay. Well,
In other words,
okay.
he's so bludgeoned that he
Yeah,
can't
that's right.
regroup. So you replace him in the middle of the Shmon Esrei. You replace him, okay?
And you start at that point?
And you start, you
have to
start at
go
the
back.
beginning of the bracha. Wherever he got confused, start at the beginning of that bracha.
makes sense.
Okay?
If he
Start
got
at the beginning of
sick,
that
he would,
bracha.
right?
Okay, what?
If he got sick.
If he got
then,
sick, sure, the same thing would happen, right? So what's the problem now? Here is Shmuel HaKatan in the middle of the bracha of Elam al Shinim, and he forgets. He gets V'blunjet. So what should have happened?
Should have replaced him.
They should have taken him off, right? They shouldn't have taken him off. Says the Gemara, V'hishkiv ba shtayim v'shalosh sha'os, and he was trying to remember it for 2 or 3 hours. V'lo ha'eluhu, right? Right? You guys complain about davening, right? Right? V'lo ha'eluhu, and what happened? And they didn't take him off. Right? Why did it say v'lo ha'eluhu? It's interesting. They didn't take him up.
They didn't take him
They didn't
up.
pick him up. What does that mean, pick him up? Because in those days when you would daven,
Down low.
you davened in a depression.
In the pit, right?
Right? You daven in a pit, right? Right? You call that mima makim kirasicha, right? You call out from the depths. So in front of the amud, there would be a step down,
Right.
right? It's all kinds of fascinating discussions about synagogue architecture. Is the floor of the synagogue lower than the floor outside? Does that count? How does it work? Right? And why don't we do that today? I mean, some places do it today. We don't do it today. Why don't we do it today? We don't do it today because of the simple reason that you can't hear, right? That if the chazan were not davening where he was davening, if he was davening in a depression, it'd be very hard to hear, So that's what we rely on, right? But other shuls have different ways in which they deal with it. Anyway, so v'lo ha'eluhu, they didn't take him out of the depression, meaning they didn't pull him out, replace him, right? They didn't yank him, right? So says the Gemara, Amai, why not? Right? Why not? V'ha'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav, said, Ta'a b'chol brachos kulan ein ma'alino. So that if a person made a mistake in any of the other brachos, you don't get rid of him. However, bebirchas had tzedukim ma'alino. So, but if you make a mistake in the bracha of the tzedukim, you make a mistake in the bracha of Elam al Shinim, what's the halacha? Out right away. Why? Why?
You're concerned
Because
that
he's
he
a
might
rabbi.
be.
No.
Oh, because what are you worried about?
Christians.
You worried maybe he's a tzduki.
Yeah, right.
Right? Maybe in other words, he gets to this bracha and he's like blah 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 blah. You know,
Yeah, right.
So what are you saying?
Making it
Oh,
real.
right. Here's a guy he can't say the bracha. Right? Why is he having a hard time saying the bracha?
Yeah.
He's having a hard time saying the bracha because maybe he's a tzduki. Get rid of him, and that's the halacha, right? That when it comes to the bracha v'lam al shinim, the guy can't do it. Boom, get rid of him. So why didn't they get rid of Shmuel Katan?
He wrote it.
Oh, so what? He wrote it,
So he's
He wrote
clearly
it.
not a Tzeduki.
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
Right.
if he wrote it a year ago and they've been using it,
Well, so right, so why not? So says the Gemara, Shiny Shmuel Hakatan, De'ihu Tikna. Shmuel Hakatan is different. Why? He was the one who wrote it. Shmuel Hakatan wrote it, so obviously he's not a Tzeduki, right? That's what Rob said, right? Obviously he's not a Tzeduki.
maybe.
Right, the Gemara's not so happy with Rab, because what does the Gemara say? The Gemara says, V'nechush dilma hadarbe. Oh, what?
Maybe he fooled us.
Maybe at the
Since
time
then
that he
he-
wrote it,
he
he wasn't
but
the
now he is.
Tzeduki, but maybe
Yeah,
now he's a
right.
Tzeduki.
He's a convert.
Maybe now he went off the derech.
Converted to
Right? Maybe now he's at risk. You know, he left the derech, he left the straight and narrow. Why aren't we concerned about that? Because they should have yanked him for that reason. He wrote it. All right, good. When he wrote it. He was a good guy, but maybe now he's not a good guy. Let's get rid of him. So says the Gemara. Listen to this answer. Says the Gemara. Amar Abaye. Abaye says, Gemiri tava lohave bisha. That if a person is good,
Don't embarrass.
they won't turn bad.
Oh,
This is right. This is what Abaye says. That if a person is good, they won't turn bad. How does that help?
Good.
How does that help us?
And Talmid Chacham, on
So
the
he-
day he dies, is...
No. How does that help us explain why Shmuel cut and why they let
Because
Shmuel
he's
cut?
not
Saying he was good, so he can't be
He was
bad.
good, so don't worry that he became a tzeduki, because according to Abaye, a Gemiri, I learned, I have a Masorah, I have a tradition, that a good guy
Doesn't go bad.
doesn't go bad. Good guy doesn't go bad. Says the Gemara. Are you kidding me? Right? Says the Gemara. Vilo? Is that really true? The Haksiv, and they bring a pasuk. Uveshuv tzadik mitzit kasov asa avel. Right? That a tzaddik can turn away from his righteousness and he can do the wrong thing. Says the Gemara. Hahu rasha meikaro. Right? When we say that a tzaddik can stop being a tzaddik and he can transgress, what are we talking about? The Gemara says we're talking about somebody who was a bad guy,
became a tzaddik.
became a tzaddik, Baal Tshuva, and now what?
Now he went back.
And now, because he wasn't a tzaddik his whole life, he can go back. But a tzaddik who was a tzaddik his whole life, what do we say?
Can't stop being a
He
tzaddik.
can't go back. A tzaddik who was a tzaddik his whole life, he can't go back. So that's what the Gemara says. Don't have to worry about Shmuel Katan. Why? Because he was a tzaddik his whole life. Because a tzaddik his whole life, he's not going to go off the derech. He's not going to become a tzeduki. You don't have to worry. Says the Gemara. Oh yeah. Right. Says the Gemara. Is that really true? Right. V'hatnan. We learn. Al tamin ba'atzmecha ad yom moscha. Right, what do we say? What do we learn? That you shouldn't believe in yourself ad yom moscha, until the day that you die. What does that mean? You shouldn't believe in yourself until the day that you
You're
die.
not immune. You could.
Because even if you're a tzaddik your whole life, you could still go off the derech. When do you know you're no longer going to go off the derech? When you're no longer driving. Right? When you're no longer alive, you know you're not going off the derech anymore. So al ta'amin ba'atzmecha, don't believe in yourself until the day that you die. So wait a second. So why didn't they get rid of Shmuel Katan? Right? First you say we don't give it to Shmuel Katan because he wrote it.
Good, bad.
Meaning he wrote it, he was a good guy. What are we worried about? Gemara says, no, leave him there because I have a tradition, a good guy doesn't become a bad guy. Oh yeah? Well, what about this pasuk? This pasuk is only referring to somebody who was started out as a bad guy, became a good guy, he can become a bad guy again. But somebody who was always a good guy can never become a bad guy. Yes, says the Gemara. Is that really true? What about al tamin ba'atzmecha ad yom moscha? What about that? And now the Gemara brings us a fascinating story. Maybe you know the story. I'm not sure. Shaharei Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Yochanan the Kohen Gadol. Shimesh B'Kahuna Gidola Shimonim Shana. He was right? He was the Kohen Gadol for 80 years. Ulevasof, and what happened at the end of those 80 years? Naased Tzeduki. At the end, he became a Tzeduki. Right? Imagine, Kohen Gadol for 80 years, and at the end of his life, he became a Tzeduki. So what does that seem to tell us? It seems to tell us, Al tamin ba'atzmecha ad yom moscha. Right? Don't believe in yourself until the day that you die. The Gemara now has a very interesting discussion about Yanai HaMelech and Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Were they the same person? Were they a different person? Maybe we say that Yochanan Kohen Gadol really started out as a bad guy, then he became a good guy, and that's why he went back. Regardless, what's the idea here? The idea is Al Tamin Ba'atzmecha Ad Yom Moscha. Don't believe in yourself until the day that you die. Now we understand Rav Chisda. What did Rav Chisda say? Right? What's the symbolism of Parshas Drachim? How do you know you've reached your destination? When you're a Talmid Chacham, when you die, and you die as a Talmid Chacham. Right? When you die, and you die as a Talmid Chacham, what does that mean? It means,
you can't make a mistake anymore.
Right? I know that, right? I know that I have reached the very end of my life, still as a Talmid Chacham, and I don't have to worry about going off the derech anymore. Al tamin ma'atzmecha ad yom moscha, and that's what we say. What is the Parshas Drachim? Where's the sign that you've arrived? The sign you've arrived is when you're a Talmid, is when you die as a Talmid Chacham. That's Rav Chisda, right? That's Rav Chisda, right? Fascinating interpretation of Rav Chisda. But the Gemara goes on. Let's go weiter, right? Rav Chisda was only one opinion, right? Rav Chisda was one opinion. The Gemara goes on, and what does the Gemara say? I hate when this happens. Right? So the Gemara goes on, and the Gemara says, that's the opinion of Rav Chisda. But we have another opinion. And what is that? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Zeh Talmid Chacham v'Yiras Chet. What are we talking about? We're talking about a Talmid Chacham who acquired Yiras Chet, who acquired fear of heaven. What does that mean? Heaven? So according to Rav, fear of sin, right? Fear of sin. So what does that mean according to Rav Nachman? Right, what does it mean? At least it's paying attention. What does it mean? It means that you could be a Talmid Chacham and you could still transgress. You can be a Talmid Chacham and you could still go off the derech. Just because you're a Talmid Chacham doesn't mean that you don't go off the derech. Right? Think about all the maskilim who were great Talmud scholars. As they used to sit on Yom Kippur smoking a cigar and eating a ham sandwich, learning Gemara. Right? You could be a Talmid Chacham and you could still go off the derech. Okay, but what added to being a Talmid Chacham makes sure you don't go off the derech? If you have Yiras Chet. If you have your right, Rav Nachman differs from Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said, no matter what you have, don't believe in yourself until you're gone. Right? But Rav Nachman says that once you have Yiras Chet, what is that an indication of? You're not going to transgress. Why? Because the Yiras Chet, coupled with being a Talmid Chacham, is going to prevent you. It's going to keep you on the straight and narrow. It's going to prevent you from transgressing. And then finally, the last opinion, right? The last opinion, which is the opinion that the Gemara brings, Mar Zutra Amar Zed Talmid Chacham Desalkale Shmatita Aliba Dehilchasa. Right? What is this? So this is a Talmid Chacham whose teachings are accepted by the people as halacha. Now, like a posek. But interestingly, right, this third opinion is dealing with something different than the first two. Right, the opinion of Rav Chisda, right, the opinion of Rav Chisda, the first opinion, and the opinion of, who was this, and the opinion of Rav Nachman, right? The opinion of Rav Nachman, the second opinion. They're dealing with how do you know that you've reached your final destination without sinning?
Right.
This final opinion, this third opinion, is how do you know that you've reached your destination of your potential? And how do you know that as a Talmid Chacham you've reached your destination of your potential? When people follow you, lahalacha. In other words, when you become a posek, when people respect your learning enough and your midos enough and your qualities enough and your personality enough to follow you as a posek, then you know that you have reached that destination. You've reached that pinnacle. It's not the end destination because that's a different thing. The first two opinions we're talking about that. That's just this. You've reached that pinnacle. So fascinating. Three. Yeah, Mike, hang on a second. Just three different opinions as to what the symbolism behind Parshas Drachim is. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, in the imbroglio about Shmuel HaKatan, why didn't the principle of Chazaka apply? In other words, Shmuel HaKatan had a Chazaka that he's not only a Talmid Chacham but a tzaddik and Yirah Shamayim and everything else. He has the Chazaka. Until that's disproved, the Chazaka should reign.
So it seems that what the Gemara is saying is that there's no Chazaka when it comes to not transgressing. And we can't that there's no Chazaka in human nature. There's no chazaka in our behavior, human nature's behavior. There might be a chazaka, a pattern in things that we do, perhaps, right? Like I sit in a seat for 3 times, so I'm demonstrating a chazaka to that seat or whatever. But there's no chazaka in human behavior because human nature doesn't lend itself to having a chazaka. I think that's how we have to understand the Gemara.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, everybody. Shkoyach. Thank you all for being here. Ron?
Thank you for coming
Shkoyach.
back. It's great.